You're listening to Mitch Hedberg, A Life in Comedy. Ron Bennington speaks with the friends and comedians who are influenced by the prolific and beloved comedian.
I order the club sandwich all the time, and I'm not even a member, man. I don't know how I get away with it.
For the next hour, the life of Mitch Hedberg will be discussed.
I like to play blackjack. I'm not addicted to gambling. I'm addicted to sitting in a semicircle.
This is Mitch Hedberg, A Life in Comedy.
Yeah, I got to write these jokes. So I sit at the hotel at night, I think of something that's funny, then I go get a pen and I write it down. Or if the pen's too far away, I have to convince myself that what I thought of ain't funny.
And here's your host, Ron Bennington.
Welcome to Mitch Hedberg, A Life in Comedy. I am Ron Bennington. Tonight we're going to celebrate the life and work of Mitch Hedberg. There's a new box set out, Mitch Hedberg, the complete vinyl collection. Comes out Friday, November 4th from Comedy Central. It includes 12-inch vinyl editions of Strategic Grill Locations, Mitch Altogether, Do You Believe in Gosh? There's rare photos, stories by Mitch's wife, Lynn Shawcroft, and essays by Doug Stanhope, Mike Birbiglia, and Margaret Cho, and a custom USB drive with MP3s of all three albums, never before heard recordings, and an uncut presentation of Mitch's 1999 Comedy Central Presents show, and more. It's a great box set for fans of Mitch's, and many of his friends are excited about it. And we're going to be talking with people like Dave Attell, Margaret Cho, Tammy Pescatelli, Doug Benson, Tom Rhodes, Todd Glass, Jack Vaughn, Greg Stone, Liz Mealy, Zoe Friedman, Mark Flanagan, and Brendan Small. Again, this is a celebration of the work of Mitch Hedberg. It's not so much a dissection of how we all felt when he passed away or how much we all miss him. There's been some time now, and I think it is time to go back and look at the work of Mitch Hedberg and say to ourselves, a brilliant guy was here. There's some real genius to Mitch's work, and we can't always be caught up in the fact that it's a cautionary tale. Mitch partied. I partied. Everybody I ever grew up with were all a cautionary tale. Go to West Virginia and New Hampshire and Ohio. There's just epidemics everywhere. There's a cautionary tale throughout the country right now. I don't want to dwell on that because I don't want to get past the fact that this was a really brilliant guy. And I think comedy needs to take itself a little more serious and hold it a little more precious when somebody steps up and does something fantastic. And I think it's up to all of us who enjoy comedy to say, you know what, there's a place for this. We need to be proud of it. So that's what tonight is about. It's the work, the art, and the creativity of Mitch Hedberg. Let's start this off with a guy who explained a couple things to me, and I heard this from a few people, because when you watch Mitch on TV, you see kind of a guy wearing shades, and he's stationary, and he's just doing these jokes, and he's got his eyes closed. And some people bring up the fact that maybe he was shy or, kind of had stage fright. But a lot of people that I talked to, they talked about how charismatic Mitch was off stage. And I found that just to be fascinating because that never comes up when you're hearing stories about him. And you'll hear it time and time again that he had a certain aura that he carried around. Let's talk to Dave Attell about his friend, Mitch Hedberg.
Socially, like with Mitch, always low-key, not much eye contact, self-effacing, easygoing. You really could never, get, for me, especially kind of New York, East Coast Jew, I was like, well, what's up? Let's make a decision here. What are we doing? Are we going out? What are we doing? And with Mitch, he was kind of like the go-with-the-flow guy. So it took a while to get used to that. But then once I did, I was like, he's really cool. He kind of he's like a presence. He doesn't really, come to a room and take it over, but he's a presence. You feel his presence.
And that's not the easiest way to make it in show business. You know,
That's a great question.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah, you've met some of the best and some of the worst, and you know that like everybody's always self-promoting, and Mitch was not like that at all. That's another thing that like separates him from today's times. He was not a self-promoter. If anything, he was like, you looked at him and you're like, who is this? Like, you know, he was like he almost looked like a grad student. You know, he's like walking around, you know, wearing dirty clothes, you know, long hair. But he was a good-looking guy, and I think all the girls wanted to take care of him, you know. And you know, when it came to like the party, like it was like a one-man shore leave, you know, with him. Like he really could hold his own and then some. And that's what I think bonded us, like the drinking, you know. And you know, we did some substances together. And you know, I could say one thing about Mitch is that, like, you know, he really in the beginning times, I think before the drugs really took hold, he really could like maintain that balance, I think, of like where, you know, the off stage and the on stage didn't get in the way of each other. And as we both know, eventually it does. So I think that was like kind of a sad time. But before that, you know, we were all like, you know, having a good time, you know.
David Tell talking about Mitch Hedberg, just hanging out with him in the kind of the place that Mitch had in comedy at that time. I asked Margaret Cho what was her favorite Mitch Hedberg memory, and she came up with one.
Me and Doug Stanhope were sitting at a bar waiting for Mitch to come down, and it was sort of like this waiting for this golden god to descend on us. And Mitch kept like not arriving, like he was doing other things. And so we were talking to Mitch on the phone. We were like trying to figure out where he was, like getting very drunk in the process. So it's a memory that doesn't even include his physical self, but it's that sort of waiting for Mitch Hedberg that was this eternal wait, like in God's waiting room.
Almost a waiting for Godot moment that Margaret Cho explained. See, this is something that I never kind of picked up on. Being a fan of Mitch is the way that he was perceived by some of his peers. This is Mitch Hedberg, A Life in Comedy. And I'm really, really excited to hear some of these people talk. And I'll tell you why. I think there was this dark cloud that hung over Mitch's memory and his work for quite a few years because it was such a shock and such a loss to lose him at his peak. But I really do feel like this is the time to start looking back at his work, his legacy of work. And I think it's really important to do that because there's very few guys that are timeless in their material. And now that the sadness is kind of put in the back, you can go back and get happy and excited, listen to some of this material again. This is always an interesting thing about comedy to me, and that's life on the road. Because a lot of times when comedians spend that week together on the road, they might have not even known each other before, but it's a very intense friendship that takes place very fast. And I think every comedian knows what I'm talking about. Like for that week, that's your partner in crime, that's your best friend, that's your family. And then when the week's over, you go off in your own ways and you look back and you go, wow, that was weird. That got a little intense for a while. Tammy Pescatelli is got some stories about being on the road with Mitch Hedberg.
I worked with him probably about 7 or 8 times. But those are the days when a lot of times when you work together, like you live together in condos. So we lived together probably for about 6 weeks of my life, you know, which was always fun. I was a huge Mitch fan via the very first time I ever had heard about him. You know, I'm from Cleveland, so I was an MC in Cleveland, and I would hang out in the office a lot. And this letter came written in crayon to the manager, and it was addressed to the woman, the manager of the Cleveland Improv, and it had all these crazy, like a rainbow, like a child's writing in crayon. And you opened it up, and the letter said, "Hello, my name is Mitch Hedberg." I don't sound like Mitch, but trust me, that's you could almost hear his voice, you know. "Hello, my name is Mitch Hedberg, and I am funny. I sure would like to work your club. why don't you book me? And then he put his telephone number and said, I will see you in Cleveland soon. Love, Mitch. And I always fascinated by that because it had all the, just had all the nuances of who he was. And the manager really liked it. And so she booked him, and I paid a guy $50 of my $250 that we used to make a week for 9 shows so I could work with Mitch that week. And we just had a really good time. And at the end, I told him the story. And at the end of the week, he handed me a little piece of paper written in crayon. He said, Dear Tammy, you are funny and you are my friend. Love, Mitch. It was so cute. So, and that's how it all started. Another time I saw him, I don't know where we were working, maybe Omaha, Nebraska, all these funny bones. And literally, you would live together in the condo for the week. And I was dressing back then like, I was an MC. He was a feature. He might have been headlining that week. I'm not real sure. But I was dressing like, the old days female comic, the lesbian comedian uniform, the vest and the T-shirt and the jeans and the big jacket. And he said to me, I got off stage, he said, I sure like your vest. And I was like, well, I think I got it at a thrift store. He said, then we shall go to the thrift store. We went to thrift stores to try to find a vest. And Mitch, you could ride with him for hours and he wouldn't, silence was comfortable with Mitch. But when he spoke sometimes, he was able to attract the same following that follows him now, years after his death. He really could have been a cult leader. I mean, he brought out this thing in people. And I remember being at the thrift store and he made friends with a couple of these people. And somehow I lost him at the thrift store and I kept looking for him and he was gone and it was getting close to showtime. And so I wrote, we didn't have cell phones back then. So I wrote a little note at the front desk and I'm like, please have him call the club. We'll come get him, whatever. And I called the club. I said, what should I do? They said, just come back. We'll take care of it. And I went to the club. I had waited so long. I had to go right from the thrift store to the club. And sure enough, as I'm getting ready to go inside, to go on stage, here comes Mitch. He bought a bicycle. It was riding a bicycle to the club with another one of the guys that he had hung out with at the thrift store. So he had bought him and this guy a bike, and they rode to the club. And I was like, Mitch, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to leave you. And he said, I just felt I wanted to hear this man's story. And I should have told you, Tammy, but I had to go hear his experiences. So we just had fun.
It is Mitch Hedberg, A Life in Comedy. That was Tammy Pescatelli. I love those stories for a couple reasons. Number one, if Tammy doesn't tell that story, it kind of lives and dies with her. Another reason why I think Mitch's legacy and these stories and the way he wrote and his notebooks and his material needs to be put out there for people to hear. Another reason why I love that story is that because she's from Cleveland, Tammy thinks that we color with a crayon. And I can't get enough of that. Let's listen to Doug Benson talk about what he thinks about the material of Mitch Hedberg.
It was just always impressive that he could just keep coming up with all of these jokes that were so short and rarely led to the next joke. I've been playing this, I'm at a comedy club in Tacoma, Washington this weekend, and they have signs up in the club that are just quotes from different comedians. And I knew I was going to be talking to you about Mitch, and when I thought it was funny when I saw that the quote from Mitch that they had on the wall is just, I like rice. Rice is great if you're hungry and want 2,000 of something, which is an amazing joke. I mean, just the setup to a joke can just be, I like rice, something that's that simple. I'm a rice fan, and here's my joke about it. And then, he's just on to the next thing, and not even necessarily his great frozen banana joke. He didn't even lump the jokes together like, here's all the food jokes, or here's all the, it was just joke after joke, and yet at the same time he also worked in a lot of stuff that was very autobiographical and show business related. Like, I remember some of my favorite things that he would say would just be like sort of commenting on how what show business was trying to do with him and how he just basically just likes to tell his jokes. And, I remember seeing him on that show, Ed, in like a guest role because David Letterman was always a huge fan of Mitch and was always trying to, get him into a sitcom or something, because that's what comics are supposed to do at the height of Mitch's success. And that clearly wasn't something he felt comfortable with or was good at. And so he just is just pure stand-up comedy and jokes. And then his presentation too, sometimes he just lay down flat on the stage and say the jokes into the microphone. Or it reminded me of early Stephen Wright stories where you'd hear about how he'd just do his one-liners while literally facing the wall in the back of the club.
That's Doug Benson talking about Mitch Hedberg. And it is interesting that he could bring up a joke of Mitch's and you could still laugh today, even if you had heard it before. There's something about comedy that always seems like it's building a sandcastle, it's just something for that moment. But occasionally, people write things that are much more permanent. And I'm always curious, did we even realize it at the time? Or did the people around him realize, hey, there's something kind of happening here? Certainly an audience came around Mitch that wasn't necessarily there just to see comedy. They were there to see Mitch. And the fantastic comedian Todd Glass talks about that a little bit.
I knew him for a while, but the first time I saw him, I was working in Nashville, and I was doing the weekend, and then he came in and just did Sunday night. And I watched I really do remember this very specifically. It sounds like something you would say and you're overly dramatizing it, but I remember watching his audience follow in. And I remembered that they treated his show like it was the theater. And I don't mean that they weren't energetic and in a good mood, but they were listening and they were paying attention. And that really made me jealous and want to work towards having an audience like that. And I just remember no one was heckling, and they just seemed kind and nice. And it was about 400 people. And I thought, man, this is the type of audience I would like to have.
But why do you think he had that connection with that audience?
I think you had to be somewhat comedy savvy to understand what he was doing. But also, I think more than that, some people don't talk about social issues or they don't talk about politics directly, but by what they talk about, he didn't really draw morons. He made fun of the right things, I felt. And just by not, it's so hard. It's in my head so clear, but then when I try to get it out, which I'm a comedian, I should be able to verbalize what I'm trying to say. But I think that's what you get when you don't feed idiots. Right. When your comedy is not feeding idiots. And a lot of people don't think they're responsible for that. I know people in radio that don't know they're responsible for it, and they don't say, "Oh, I don't think I'm responsible for my audience." They indirectly say it when they complain about their audience. They'll be like, "Oh, I did a show. There were so many hecklers. Oh, I did this." Yeah, well, that's the audience you're drawing. You can't not be responsible for the audience you're drawing, especially when it's just through your stand-up. Now, that's not true as if you were in a movie or something and you might be drawing people that don't represent your stand-up. But when you're one of these comedians, that's all they know you through is your stand-up. You're responsible for the audience you draw. So I just remember noticing that, and I remember talking about it. I'm like, wow, look at this crowd. They're just there. They're paying attention. They're listening. And there were a lot of young people, all types of people. That's another thing, all types of people, and I was very, very envious of that.
That's Todd Glass talking about Mitch Hedberg. And it's always interesting to me that when you start to hear these stories that you've never heard before, how many other comedians are out there or audience members that have unique Mitch Hedberg stories. So this is just really a scratch of the surface. If you're interested in Mitch, and you should be if you're interested in comedy, there is a new box set out called Mitch Hedberg, The Complete Vinyl Collection. Comes out Friday, November 4th from Comedy Central. It includes 12-inch vinyl editions of Strategic Grill Locations, Mitch All Together, Do You Believe in Gosh? Then there's also rare photos and stories by Mitch's wife, Lynn Shawcroft, and essays by Doug Stanhope, Mike Birbiglia, and Margaret Cho. And a custom USB drive with MP3s of all three albums, never before heard recordings, and an uncut presentation of Mitch's 1999 Comedy Central Present show. When we started to put together this program, a person said to me, if anyone says that they were Mitch's best friend, they were wrong, because he was a very shy and solo guy. He was just the guy who wanted to be on his own. And yet I've heard different things from a lot of different people who felt very, very close to Mitch, particularly at different times of his life. Obviously, he's a complicated dude. He really was. But that's what you're going to get in a genius. That's one of the things that we forget. When you have somebody that's extraordinary, they're not ordinary. They're just a different type of dude. And those are the lives and those are the work that we like to pay attention to. Here's somebody, the comedian Tom Rhodes, who was a running buddy of Mitch's for some time, and he wants to share a Mitch Hedberg story.
I moved to New York City after the sitcom, and then that's where we became like kind of best friends for a couple years. And he started to get great as a comedian. And this was a time after my sitcom where all of show business had gone ice cold on me. And he treated me like a brother, like a big brother, like he looked up to me. And we had we had a lot of fun together. We did a lot of narcotics together. And he got me in with Houston at the Laugh Stop. And I had never played there before. We actually both co-headlined. We both took less money so we could work together. And the guy that ran the club down there, Mark Babbitt, we had so much fun. The local Houston comics everybody would come. There was a hotel called the Allen Park Inn, which no longer is there. It was this massive old hotel where like astronauts would go have affairs in the 60s. And so no one stayed on the backside of this hotel. And we did mushrooms, ran naked in the sprinkler system, diving in the pool. All these local Houston comedians were watching.
So in those days, it was all fun, though, right?
All fun, man. Just it was so much fun. Ralphie May heard me tell that story and said that he was there running naked through the sprinklers, but he wasn't. I would not forget the image of a naked Ralphie May running through the sprinklers.
I'm going to prefer to think that Ralphie was there. I really am. I'm going to keep that story in my mind, but picture Ralphie May as part of those Three Musketeers. Tom Rhodes was there when Mitch kind of first blew up in Montreal. And the Montreal Comedy Festival is one of those things where a comedian, particularly a young comedian, can go, have a great set, and then everyone in show business is interested in doing business with that person. It's happened. It doesn't happen every year, but occasionally it does happen where a person walks in just being a traveling comedian and walks out with major deals from networks. This is Tom Rhodes talking about when he and Mitch went up to Montreal.
So we're in Montreal, and I'm thinking Montreal is the place of opportunities, right? And that's where all the big decision makers of the business are. Hedberg didn't give a shit. He's got like a massive bag of cocaine in his pocket, and he's trying to give it to me like at certain times, and I'm like, hey, chill out, brother, right? So he's the belle of the ball. He's the one that everyone's talking about, and he honestly destroyed the place. And I think he had some huge deal from Fox after that. And then some side deal that I was on was some production company was interested in doing a animated TV show of me and Hedberg together, and it was our jokes. that they wanted to animate because they thought, we both had like an absurdist element in some of the jokes that we had. So this is 1998, and this is the only thing I have going on in 1998. And we had 2 conference calls with these people that wanted to make this show. And at one point, this guy said something. Hedberg made a suggestion, and the guy said something like, no, that wouldn't work, or something like that. And then Hedberg goes, well, fuck you people. I'm going to be famous without you. And he hung up the phone. And like, I'm sitting there, okay, well, I guess I don't have anything going on for 1998.
I love that story that Tom Rhodes just told, not just because a friend of mine had a career setback, and that would have been enough. But the fact that you see a different side of Mitch there, that you don't normally hear anyone's talk about him being mad. But I love the fact that they always bring up the fight or flight, but some people just walk away from it. Some people just go, hey, this isn't for me. And it seemed like Mitch always had an idea that he was going to do what he wanted to do. Even when he bumped up against things that didn't work for him, it seemed like it was easy enough for him to slide back and get back in the Hedberg direction. I also think it's very interesting that in his life and times, he was around a couple of different scenes that started out. I mean, there's Tom Rhodes talking about them being offered a chance to do animated stuff. But right after that, he got involved with a couple of TV shows like Dr. Katz and home movies with Brendan Small. We talked to Brendan about Mitch.
I started doing comedy in the late 90s in Boston. And one of the cool things about being in Boston in the late 90s is there was a locally produced show called Dr. Katz. And it was done in Boston, in Watertown, Massachusetts, just outside of Cambridge. And I had gotten in tight with those guys after doing comedy, and I started developing home movies with Lauren Bouchard. And I would hang out at the production company all the time. And what I would do was I would just hang out, and I would try to. There were a lot of comics around, and I wanted to kind of just hear them record. And I think we had just done the pilot for home movies. And I was sitting with my notebook one day, and I heard somebody. I didn't know who they were, but I thought it was like an old Louisiana black dude doing about an hour worth of the tightest jokes I'd ever heard in my life, just playing through these speakers. And I asked the engineer, and I said, who is this guy? He's really, really funny. Every single joke is so tight. He's got such an developed attitude. And he told me that was Mitch Hedberg. And then I remembered, I had heard about this guy, Mitch Hedberg, because he had just kind of, I guess, became the thing that everyone was talking about after a Montreal Just for Laughs festival. And he had gotten all these deals, and he'd done all this stuff. And I had heard about him, but I hadn't seen him or heard his comedy. And that day I was immediately a fan. So I talked to Lauren. I said, we got to get him on the show. He's got a great voice. He's going to be perfect for this. And so we reached out, and that's how we got in touch with him.
Now there's so many comedians that just go on these animated shows using their own voice that it's kind of commonplace, but we forget it was pretty shocking at the time when that happened. Other people were going, wait, he's not doing a character, he's just doing himself. And that won over the animated business, where now you're more likely just to hear a comedian being themselves. Another thing that he was around for the change of was alternative comedy, particularly in Los Angeles. The, I believe now world famous club Largo is something that clubs all over the country try to do, where you're mixing certain comedians with certain types of musicians to create a really kind of a cool show. And has worked gangbusters for them. Obviously, any comedian in the country now would love to work for Largo. But Mitch was one of the first as they got involved with it. Let's talk with Mark Flanagan from Largo.
At the time, it was a very interesting thing because comedians in that what they call the alternative things weren't going out like Dice Clay and some of these big name things. They were wearing they were slackery kind of like low key, geeky kind of people. And here comes Mitch with like the sunglasses, the hair, didn't try to be in a Kurt Cobain thing, but kind of looked like that among, he was beautiful fella just walked in and was like, it was like, holy shit, what is this? And then also was the sweetest guy in the world and very defacing and, but also just quite shy. But then when he hit the stage, it was like, boom, it was this fully formed thing where other people over the years, and the alternative comedy thing had been going before I tapped into it. I had these very serious songwriters that were singing songs about the fact that their lovers have left and they may not come back. And I was like, fuck, I need to do something to lighten this up. And so that's why I thought I'll bring in comedians, and in Ireland, when I was a kid, I would see shows and there would be a comedian open for a musician or even the other way around, so I just thought that this might be a good thing to do this. And so I was very fortunate. I always consider myself very fortunate to have met Mitch, but also around the same time I met Elliott Smith and Amy Mann and other songwriters that were unbelievable. So there was a kind of a feeling there for a few years that was like, wow, these people are going to be around. These are such talents,
What is it about Mitch that he was able to come up with this unique style of comedy?
I think that it was, his background and it had a lot to do with his environment. Like, I mean, obviously you're not born to be a stand-up comedian or a writer, but I think that it was just one of those things that he always had as a kid, and his parents were able to not distract him from that and say, you have to do this and you have to do that. There was obviously some, I don't know the parents and stuff, but it's one of those things that I feel that's his purpose. You know what I mean? I'm not a religious person, but like I can't imagine him doing any other trade but being an actor, funny, a comedian, or a writer, like in that genre. And he definitely had all of those qualities. I think that he was definitely leaning towards trying to do some unique TV stuff. And in the era of Netflix, I think he would have thrived. So I think that there was that. He had that about him, but also he had a look about him that was undeniable. Like, everybody loved him, but his look thing was just like, look at this guy. I mean, there's all these nerds, he's not one of those guys, So he appealed to men, women, everything. And, I just mean as a person, he was such a lovely guy that I think that people couldn't help but, there's just this thing about certain people you meet in your life and you just go, yeah, there's a good egg. And he was a good egg,
Mark Flanagan from Largo talking about Mitch Hedberg. As I said earlier, everybody around the country wants to start their own version of Largo, but unfortunately for them, they don't have John Bryan and Amy Mann and Paula F. Tompkins all living close by and ready to drop in and do sets. So it's a real unique scene in Los Angeles, and very, very cool that Mitch was involved in that early on. This is another thing I found out as we were doing this, that Mitch was also one of the reasons and one of the early signings for Comedy Central Records. We have Jack Vaughn here at Sirius XM, and he ran Comedy Central Records, one of the people who was there when it started. And it's always funny with business people, sometimes they're involved because it's good business, and occasionally they're involved because they really believe in the artist and they really believe in the material. And Jack has dedicated a big portion of his life, his creative life, into Mitch Hedberg's career and his legacy.
The reason I started Comedy Central Records was because of Mitch. I had seen him do about 7 minutes on Premium Blend. He had this joke where he goes, I can't wait to get off stage because I got a roll of Lifesavers in my pocket and the next one is pineapple. And so this was sort of the early phases of the internet, and I went online to find him, and he had a self-release CD called Strategic Grill Locations. And I bought it and memorized it and couldn't believe that there was something that was that good that wasn't commercially available to the public. So that was really the catalyst. Like, I need to put out comedy records, and had always been a fan of comedy, but that was the one where it's like, oh my God, there's something that good out there that everyone doesn't know about. This needs to happen. So approached Comedy Central about starting the record label.
So a comedian literally changed your life.
100%. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
I love that, man. I love that you just go through those 3 different scenes early on and find out that Mitch was involved in 3 cool things that happened in a space of just a couple years. We are talking about Mitch Hedberg. It's a life in comedy. Now, if you were a fan of comedy or you're doing comedy, this is something that you need to own. Mitch Hedberg, The Complete Vinyl Collection, comes out Friday, November 4th from Comedy Central. It includes 12-inch vinyl editions of Strategic Grill Locations, Mitch All Together, Do You Believe in Gosh, Rare Photos, stories by Mitch's wife, Lynn Shawcroft, and essays by Doug Stanhope, Mike Birbiglia, and Margaret Cho. And a custom USB drive with MP3s of all 3 albums, never before heard recordings, and uncut presentation of Mitch's 1999 Comedy Central Present show, and more. Occasionally, I get to do some pretty cool things, or I'm there for some pretty cool moments. But after this program, we're going to be doing an interview with Lynn Shawcroft, talking about her responsibilities of making sure Mitch's legacy gets out there. And it's a daunting thing for her because she wants it to be great. She wants it to be the way Mitch would want this stuff presented. And obviously Mitch isn't here. But I had this opportunity to walk into Jack Vaughn's office with Lynn, and I was standing with her the first time she looked over and saw this box set. And it's just beautiful, man. It's just gorgeous. And it was sitting around some other comedians' box sets, and Lynn goes, "Oh, ours is so much bigger. That must mean it's better." I just thought it was so sweet to know that she wants to share Mitch's work with people and see the look on her face when she saw how gorgeous this was. It is a tough thing dealing with legacy. Here's something that I think in comedy is one of the coolest things. Is it's very rare to know that you're having moments that can change your life. And a comedian works so hard and so long before they get to a national platform. And we had the chance to talk to Zoe Friedman, who at the time was booking comedians for the Letterman show. And she was responsible for bringing Mitch to the Letterman show.
I was going back and looking, I did some scouring online, and those jokes were the most resonant in my head. Like when I still quote Mitch Hedberg jokes to somebody, they're from that first set. It's interesting. I would have thought they were from, an amalgamation of all the sets, because that's the other thing. And then I will get back to that question is that, one of the biggest accomplishments for me as a producer on Letterman was to find that comedian who Dave wanted to have back, right, and establish that relationship. And that Mitch was one of those. So that was a proud moment for me and great for Mitch as well, right? It serves both parties. But he handled it well. He had that sort of joyfulness and that sort of childlike thing that just was almost on, on high for that first performance, because it is so incredibly exciting, for the comedians, right? This was their ultimate, and I got to be part of it, which was a piece of that made that job my favorite job to this day almost, that I could be part of such a big thing for comedians, and so what I loved about Mitch's first set was that he was able to actually go off script and have his, whether he pre-planned those in terms of like, I think you guys are tricking me so I can get off stage, because they're applauding so much. And that's how I would always warn the comedians in some level, like you're going to go out there and you're going to get a lot of applause breaks because that's kind of, they're trained to do that kind of, and it's going to throw off your pace or whatever. But he was able to really find
moments to go off script and kind of ad lib and be playful. And afterwards, as I was rewatching, I was like, I hope I gave him a big hug after, because it was so fun. It was such a great set. But he was really excited after and excited before. And anyway, but Mitch, I would tell you, was always, he was very organized. He was so prolific, and he was really easy to work with. He was not somebody who dug his heels in on a joke or an order. We had great flow and ease to our working sessions. It was good fun. He was a hard worker. He was willing to try things, and if he believed in something, he believed in something. But it was like, there are a lot of comics who just all of a sudden go, the man is keeping me down. I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm letting you do all your jokes and just staying close with, whatever it is. But he was never like that. He was always really collaborative and amenable. And it was always fun when he came to the show, because again, I got to break him for the show. So that was a nice, notch in my belt. And because I found somebody that Dave liked and wanted to have back. And that was the ultimate goal.
That's Zoe Friedman talking about Mitch's first time doing Letterman. By the way, we got to do something with Zoe Friedman, because she has more comic stories than just about anyone I've ever met before. It was really, really a pleasure talking to her about Mitch Hedberg. One of the things that we wanted to do here on Mitch Hedberg, A Life in Comedy, we've talked to a lot of his peers and business people that he worked with. After this program, we'll be talking with his wife, Lynn Shawcroft, about what she plans on doing with this amazing amount of material that she has that Mitch has left behind. But I wanted to talk to a couple of the young comedians who weren't necessarily peers, but to give you an idea of the echo of Mitch's career still is in comedy today. This is a young comedian breaking out right now in New York City, so keep your eye out for him. This is Greg Stone.
When I was coming up, all the open mic guys were doing Mitch. Everybody was trying to. I tried to be one-liner for a week and a half. It did not work well, but you couldn't now you see a lot of Louis guys, a lot of Bill Burr guys, and you're like, oh, you guys are just ripping off those dudes. But back then, everyone was trying to be Mitch Hedberg. I mean, how many? Look, if you watch, I love Hannibal and what he does, but I remember old videos of Hannibal and who's the guy with the guitar, Dimitri Martin. They were Mitch Hedberg. When they first started, they found their own voice, they found their own way, but they were with 100% Mitch Hedberg.
And it's not a bad place to start. When you're a young comedian, it's probably a smart idea to sit down for a year before you ever get on stage and just try to write pure jokes in the way that Mitch Hedberg did. Then later you can add whatever it is to your personality, but try to understand how this guy wrote and how this guy thought and how that bare bones way he had put together to write a joke. I mean, musicians will play for years before they get on stage. They'll study really, really great players. But for some reasons, comedians just go, well, I kind of think I'm funny. I'll go up on Thursday. I don't think it's a bad idea at all that people sit down and start to think about Mitch from that direction. Here's another young comedian also breaking out and doing very, very well for herself. This is Liz Mealy talking about Mitch.
Mitch, I mean, for me, he's the best. Whenever somebody asks me about what it takes to be a good comic, I say it's an interesting perspective. So when you first start doing stand-up, you're just trying to find out what's funny, but that's not what makes you drawn to Mitch. That's not what makes you drawn to Chappelle. That's not what makes you drawn to Carlin. It's their perspective on stuff, because we're all talking about the same shit. I mean, there's a couple of things that, what I liked about him is almost the way people talk about Seinfeld. He would see ideas and jokes and things that most people would look over. So, I always think of the classic where he goes, escalators can never be broke. They can only become stairs. Sorry for the convenience. And it's like every single day people are walking up broken escalators, and it's just it's a nuisance. And he thought of this positive, actually it still functions, not the way you wanted it to, but it still works. And so for me, his stand-up is actually oddly positive if you really think about it. And his perspective is so uniquely him that I could quote 4 or 5 Mitch Hedberg jokes, and most people would at the very least know it's the same person saying it, if not knowing it's Mitch. And that's something I've always said is the key to a good comic, is a truthful, interesting perspective.
That's Liz Mealy talking about Mitch Hedberg. We're talking about young comics still being into Mitch. Doug Benson told us a story about an open mic he had the chance to see.
I remember at a time that thinking about Mitch, where I was doing a show in Jacksonville, Florida, and the opening act was extremely raw. He just hadn't had much experience under his belt. And one of his bits was he just said, "And now I'm going to tell you some Mitch Hedberg jokes." And then he told the jokes and didn't even try to do an impression, just told the Mitch Hedberg jokes. Yeah. And the audience, liked it perfectly fine. They enjoyed it, I mean, the guy owned up to it, but I was still like, this isn't right. But the jokes are so good that you can just stand there and say them and get laughs.
But you can do an impression of Mitch, right, Doug?
Well, are you asking me to?
Yes, I am.
Well, the bit that I did in the marijuana logs was it's all about a guy who works at, I just imagine Mitch doing this. He works at the drive-through window at KFC, and I had to come up with a code to sell weed at the drive-through window. So I came up with, all you had to do was ask for extra biscuits. The problem is at KFC, a lot of people ask for extra biscuits. And then he gets busted, and then the final line of the bit is, now I work at Taco Bell, and the code is still extra biscuits.
Doug Benson. We're talking about Mitch Hedberg. And, a lot of times we'll sit down and talk about some of these jokes. And I actually came into this thinking, hey, you could just read his jokes and they would be funny enough. Like you could just line these up in a book and they would read funny, and they would. There's no doubt about that. But a lot of times we talk about him as a writer, and we forget the fact that he was an incredible performer. I never heard anybody talk on stage in the same style that he did. And it was an odd, kind of a cool throwback style. He reminded me of somebody like from Kerouac's age. And also going through this, I have to just tell you this story very, very quickly. But after this program, I interview Lynn Shawcroft, Mitch's wife and partner and, creative confidant. And she, unasked, just mailed some of Mitch's notebooks here. And first of all, I'm stunned and immediately felt like, oh, don't let anything happen to these notebooks. Don't be the idiot who lost or spilled something on one of Mitch Hedberg's notebooks. But I started to go through them. And there are these hard kind of cover notebooks, something that you would expect poetry to be written in. These weren't just, grabbing some notebooks at the 7-Eleven. And he writes in this very unique handwriting. But what was great about it is there'd be like these little thoughts and like a hysterical joke or a beginning of a joke. And then his plain reservations, another joke, a little cartoon that he had drawn there. And as I'm going through it, I'm like, man, I don't know anybody who thinks this way. Does he think like a musician? Does he think like a painter? It certainly doesn't seem like he thinks the way a comedian would, but then again, he does. But these notebooks are fascinating. And I'm like saying to Lynn, I go, why would you mail that here? And she's like, I've got just tons of them. He just wrote down things and collected them all the time. It's just fascinating stuff. And one of the reasons why we're doing Mitch Hedberg, A Life in Comedy, is just to say there's some precious stuff out there that isn't always taken care of by the comedy community. You know what I mean? Like somebody's lyrics get sold for a lot of money, whether it's Bob Dylan or Lennon's, and what the movie industry does with saving different films. Comedy doesn't do that. There really should be a comedy version of the Hard Rock Cafe where you're sitting eating a burger under Mitch Hedberg's pants. This art form is just as valuable, and Mitch proves this all the way through. Let's go back to David Tell talking about the kind of unique way that Mitch put his material together.
He was always working. He always had his notebook. And when you looked at his notebook, it looked kind of like I guess you could say like and like once again, it's not PC, but it looked like a girl's notebook, like in junior high. Like there were stickers on it and like a lot of doodles. But then he would have his writings because Mitch was also, he could draw. He was like an artist, and he also was a musician. So there was a lot of ideas in there. And he had that notebook, and I would always look at it. It was so funny. I was like, well, what is that? Is that a diary? And it was really just his comedy notebook and other ideas, like Da Vinci style, and a lot of stuff in there.
I love that he said that Da Vinci style, because it really is in the way that you can't quite figure out the way he thinks. And that's the other amazing thing about comedy is that, you look at people who were Mitch's peers, David Tell or Lewis Black, Tom Rhodes, Doug Stanhope, and those guys would feel comfortable together and enjoy each other's stuff, but they write and they think totally differently. It's not like a music scene where it's coming out of Seattle where everything sounds like grunge. Comedians will be drawn to people who do things totally opposite of the way that they work. And I hope that there's a chance for people to see some of these notebooks. And again, this is something that Lynn Shawcroft understands, that she knows that she's holding on to this legacy. And in the next hour after we finish this program, Lynn will be talking about some of her plans for Mitch's work in the future. And the reason why it should be held precious is because that it is. This is timeless material. So let's hear from some folks that want to talk about the fact that Mitch's stuff belongs out there forever. This is Todd Glass.
Would have fit today, would have fit 20 years from now, because it's just these really cool, these brilliant observations that are just so sometimes, just so beautifully crafted and sometimes just silly, sometimes poignant, but I'll every so often I'll go a year and a half, 2 years without listening to any of his old stuff, and then just be in the mood one night to smoke a little pot and put one of his CDs on and just go, wow, I forgot about that joke. I forgot about that joke. A lot of times, you just remember some of the classics, but you forgot about how many other. You're like, holy shit, or stuff I never heard still.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I never even heard this. How come I never heard this? A friend of mine had some stuff. I'm like, no, I never heard this.
So many of those jokes just land so consistently. It's a tough thing to pull off.
It is a tough thing. When you're low energy, and it's very hard to have an arc. It's possible, obviously, guys do it like Mitch Hedberg and Todd Barry, but you have to be, the lower the energy you are, the more your jokes have to be just crafted and put together. And I think that's what was so brilliant about it. No offense to myself, but, I can get off on energy, or I can do other things. With him, it was like just putting it all together so brilliantly. So it went boom, 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 and then it rose and it rose and it got funnier and funnier, and always still fun to listen to. And, the good thing about this, I didn't wait till Mitch died to, of course, once someone's dead, you look at their work a little differently. But like I said, when Mitch was alive, I felt the same way, watching him, like I said, that night in Nashville. And I'd seen Mitch before that, but that was the one time I saw him when it was all Mitch Hedberg fans coming in to see him. And I watched them file in. And I knew it when they were filing in. I was turning to the other comedian because, I was working the week before, and, it wasn't the same audiences. I wasn't really a draw then at all. So it was really just the audience that came out. And I thought, what a difference. His audience versus the audience that had just come out all week.
Todd, thanks so much for sharing this, man. You're great.
Fuck Mitch Hedberg.
Okay. Todd Glass, one of the funniest people in the world, and one of the few people who would ever say, no offense to myself, but he's just terrific. Here's Margaret Cho talking about the fact that Mitch's material will live on for a long time.
Because he was brilliant. He will always be a perennial. He's an evergreen. Everybody loves Mitch, and he had the ability to do something very few of us could do. He's a lot like Stephen Wright, who's still around. He's brilliant, and it's all a one-liner, and it's incredible. And Mitch is the same.
That's Margaret Cho talking about Mitch Hedberg and the fact that it seems like this material is going to be around for a long time, especially if we take care of it and keep an eye on it. You know, Mitch has a special place in my heart because Mitch Hedberg was the first time my kids turned me on to a comedian. They had caught him on TV, and, you know, they were like saying to me, oh, you got to see this guy. He's great. And they're already doing the voice and stuff. And these are little kids. And I remember just thinking like, yeah, sure. Because I'm thinking in my head, like it's going to be somebody making balloon animals or one of those talking hand puppets or whatever kids are into. But when I finally got around to seeing it and I'm laughing at the jokes, after that, it was like kind of meaningful to me that my kids were getting humor now on like next level for little kids. But I think there's something into that. I think little kids can understand those jokes because they're silly and they're looking at the world with some innocence. You look at some of those jokes and they seem like they're written by a guy who just got to this planet, you know, because his eyes are wide open to stuff that we take for granted. And I had a chance to talk to Jack Vaughn, who's been very, very important in Mitch's legacy, putting out his material while Mitch was alive and then making sure that Mitch's material got out after he passed away. This is Jack Vaughn, the man who started Comedy Central Records and who works as head of comedy here at SiriusXM.
The records represent probably most of his available output. I would say 90% of the stuff that Mitch did in his career is on record. And because he didn't really have a film or TV career aside from doing some stand-up on TV shows. So it just hurts me to think of what he could have done later in his career because he was just getting better and better. I spoke to him about a week or two before he died, and we were talking about releasing his third record and recording it. He had about 20 good minutes at the time, and he thought, this was March or April. He thought about, he'd be ready to go maybe October with a new one, and he'd been recording his sets on a handheld tape recorder, and they were just him. It was a mono tape recorder. There was no audience. And they had maybe 20 or 30 of these recordings. So that's all we had of the material when he died. So it was such good material. It was just heartbreaking that it wasn't enough for an album, right? And it wasn't in good enough form for us to release. And at the same time, it wasn't the album that Mitch wanted to release anyway. So we agonized over this for years. I talked with Lynn. We went back and forth for years and years. And then what we wound up doing is taking all those tapes, going into the studio, and they're really, really low quality recordings of just him. We Frankensteined together, I think 41 minutes worth of content of it's him screwing around on stage and telling his material. And I combed through the first two albums to make sure that we weren't repeating any material on this album. And so all the audience is from other comedy shows that we had recorded, and nothing about that third record is that live show. We wanted to frame the conversation in a way that said, this is not Mitch's final album. This is not the album Mitch wanted to make. but it's the only thing that we have of his that we can put out, and it would be criminal to the fans and future generations of Mitch lovers to not put this material out and not have it out there. And it's a really sophisticated humor, because it might, if you look at a lot of Mitch's jokes on paper, some of them aren't even jokes. Like how a banana and a street light are the exact opposite. How, on a street light, red means hold on, yellow means slow down, green means go ahead. But, on a banana, it's the exact opposite. Green means hold on, and yellow means where'd you get that banana? It's like, that's not, is that even a joke? It's not, but just the way he delivers it is so, and just the abstract humor of that is, I feel like at the same time, both sophisticated and hilarious. And to your point, I've talked to so many people who said, "Oh yeah, I turned my parents on to Mitch, and they love him more than I do." It's an intergenerational thing. Yeah, Mitch was one of the nicest people you could hope to meet, and he had one of the best outlooks. Like, what people tend to forget about that time is that humor, and stand-up comedy in particular, was typically pretty snarky, and it's just really sort of cynical. And Mitch came in and just had this sort of outlook that was so positive and so great. And a great example of this is his Fritos joke about how they have Texas grill Fritos, which are Fritos with grill marks on them. The average stand-up of the time would go, "Really? Grill marks on Fritos? Who's the advertising genius who came up with this one?" But Hedberg just took it like he was "Oh, hell yeah, it makes me think of summertime, when Dad would be in the backyard throwing down some Fritos. Hey, better flip that one, Dad, you know how I like it." And he took such a positive spin on it. It's tragic because, in addition to being such a nice guy, and you think about the jokes that we could be listening to now and enjoying. It's a double tragedy, because he was an amazing personality and just a great comic.
That's Jack Vaughn talking about the legacy of Mitch Hedberg. There's a fantastic box set out, and by the way, I think this is great for fans, but this is also a terrific present for somebody who doesn't know Mitch Hedberg at all. And you might be thinking about somebody in college right now and thinking, if you laid this box set on them, you could change the way they looked at the world itself. One of the things I was thinking as we were going through this, comedians tend to talk about Mitch and his work, but wouldn't it be great if somebody would write a piece on his work, the kind of people who write about, E.E. Cummings or Ursa Pound, or write about any of the beat poets, because I think Mitch's stuff should be looked at by somebody from the outside, somebody who's just looking at it for the way a person can use the language. The box set, Mitch Hedberg, the complete vinyl collection, comes out Friday, November 4th from Comedy Central. It includes 12-inch vinyl editions of Strategic Grill Locations, Mitch Altogether, Do You Believe in Gosh, Rare Photos, stories by Mitch's wife, Lynn Shawcroft, and essays by Doug Stanhope, Mike Birbiglia, and Margaret Cho. And a custom USB drive with MP3s of all 3 albums, never before heard recordings, an uncut presentation of Mitch's 1999 Comedy Central Presents show, and more. This has been Mitch Hedberg, A Life in Comedy, and I want to thank all the people who were involved with this tonight. Dave Attell, Margaret Cho, Tammy Pescatelli, Doug Benson, Tom Rhodes, Todd Glass, Jack Vaughn, Greg Stone, Liz Mealy, Zoe Friedman, Mark Flanagan, and Brendan Small. I also want to end this show tonight with, I believe, one of the great comedic artists of his generation, talking about another great comedic artist of his generation. This is the one and only Dave Attell.
And another thing that I liked about Mitch was that not only was he super clean, he also was like super true to his material. He was me, and like how it is, if it's not going well, you kind of like, just like bear down and get through it. With Mitch, like he would totally set up and go like, "Hey, this is not working. It's not working." He would still do his time and everything, but like on TV. Like you've seen that a couple times with him where he's like, I don't know. I don't know what's going on here. This is not happening. And he would do his time, but you could just tell that like he wasn't going to pretend that everything was going great when it wasn't. And that was not his fault. He was doing his job with the crowd. Like it was not his crowd. Didn't get it. And I myself would have been the birthday clown and just like did it differently because I guess I didn't believe in myself like he did. But he really did stick to his guns, and I admire that about him too. Now that I think of it, and to all the Hedberg fans, I run into you everywhere on the road, and I always love when you come up and tell me how much you were a fan of Mitch. It really just makes me smile, and I know he also, if there is a place where you can look down on others, he's doing that. So, just to the fans. So,
take care, Dave.
Now I'm getting teary.